This short video is going to give you some tips and ideas for creating your scientific posters. Scientific posters are a way to share and celebrate your research with several different kinds of audiences. The image you see here is one of the Boise State templates for the College of Engineering. There are several, and I'll make those available to you outside of this presentation. So the first thing you want to do when you're preparing to create your poster is do what you should always do anytime you have a new writing situation, and that is to assess the rhetorical situation. So you want to consider the purpose. Why are you creating this poster? What is the purpose of your research? What is the purpose of the situation? So most cases, that is, again, to share out the research that you've been doing with an audience, maybe at a conference, maybe at the senior design show, but with an audience of other peer scientists, and to really give them a very brief overview of what you learned and what you accomplished in a short amount of time. Your audience, as I just mentioned, is likely going to be other scientists, other individuals who are pretty well versed in the information that you're sharing, but you're also going to have a somewhat general audience depending on where the poster will live and be displayed. So many of the posters that are created for this program are displayed in the hallways, in the buildings, and so you want to keep that a little bit more general audience in mind as well. You'll also need to think about the context of the situation. You are creating a poster, and yes, the posters will be large, but there's no way that you can put the amount of information on them that's contained in your actual report. So you really want to keep in mind the context, the way that people are going to view it, walking around, spending just a few minutes looking at your information. You want to catch their attention, deliver the most important information in the most impactful and abbreviated way so that they only need to spend a few minutes to understand what you did and why it was significant. And of course, all of these parts of the rhetorical situation work together to create the information that you need to effectively meet the situation demands. So first, you need to determine the content that you're going to include. So the poster, I like this saying, the poster is a visual abstract of your research. So really, it is a way to present the most basic information about what you did, and to really make that available to the scientific world in general. So you are going to take the ideas from your research, from the report document that you've created, and you're going to make that into a visual form. That means that it's going to have to be extremely brief. So you have to really pick out the most important pieces of information and give them in the most abbreviated way. So once you've decided what those key pieces of information are, you need to organize that content. And I like to think about it as the textual content and also the visual content. Okay, so your textual content is going to be the words you use. You're going to tell the story of your research, and really think of it as a story that someone can follow what's going on and what you did and what you found, and why it matters. You're going to label all of your sections, and you're probably going to match the sections that you had in your report to some respect. Probably not all the sections, but the main sections that people expect to see in a scientific report are also going to be the main sections that you're going to see on your poster. You need to keep your text brief. This is a visual display of your information, and you need to keep it as brief as possible. So about 250 words per section is kind of a decent rule of thumb, or 1,000 body text words on a poster, if that makes sense. So there's a couple of ways to think about it. It's not very many words, and you need to keep it really concise, or people aren't going to be able to read it, nor are they going to want to read it. So if you think about probably about 700 words of actual paragraph text describing each section of your report, and then about 300 words or so for your acknowledgments and your captions and other things that you're going to have under your visuals. And then, of course, you have to edit this content to perfection. So you're going to want to write it as streamlined as you possibly can. You're really going to want to go over it and over it to try to say as concisely as you can what it is that you need to say, and that you haven't made any embarrassing errors, that you've used appropriate vocabulary, and that it is both accessible and professional. Then you want to assess your visual content. So what are you going to put? Since this is a visual display, you definitely want to rely on visuals to communicate key information. When people are looking at a poster, they don't want to just stand there and read a bunch of text. They would like to see visual evidence of what you're telling them. You need to label those visuals and provide scale. If you don't label your visuals and give a sense of scale, all that good work that you got in those images that you've created are not very useful. So make sure that you're providing those labels and scale markers just like you would in your report, but of course as abbreviated as possible. Keep your graphics really simple. Again, this is a visual display, much like a PowerPoint. People can't take in a ton of detail on a poster like this. And so you want to keep your graphics simple, but you need to make sure that they're accurate. You can't take out so much information from the graphic that it loses meaning. So keep that in mind, but simplify them as much as possible. Avoid any kinds of 3D displays and that kind of thing when it comes to graphs and charts. And then, of course, be aware of your image quality. You are going to print this poster and you're going to print it in a very large scale, so you want your image quality to be really good. Okay, so the next thing you want to do once you've kind of divvied out your written content and your visual content, then you're going to want to consider these principles of good design again. So the power zone is one principle that's really applicable here in a poster. And so I've taken this poster template and kind of highlighted the area that's considered the power zone, and that is across the top of the page and down the left-hand side. As a reminder, this is because we read from left to right and down the page in the Western world and in the English language. And so you want to keep that in mind, that the most important information is going to be right up here in the corner. Okay, so that means, of course, titles are going to be important, and they're going to go across the top of the page. And the title is the thing that's going to get people interested. It's going to be the largest font, going to be the thing that they see first. So, of course, that should be in a prime position. And then this side right here, the left-hand side of the page is also considered part of the power zone. Then the principles of good design, just as a refresh, these CRAP principles, as I call them, to remember them: contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity, can all help you to put this information on to the poster in a way that is easy to read and understand. So we're going to apply those principles to the content, and here's a few tips for that. First, when you're thinking about the power zone, again, as I said, put the title across the top and list the most important information in the top left if you can. We're going to look at some samples, and this is not always the case, but there are some ways that you can do this, and this is a general tip for posters, is to put that most key information, oftentimes your conclusions, actually as the first thing that the people would encounter up there in the top left-hand side. So there's not always done that way, but there's a few ways, tips that I have for figuring that out that I'll talk about when we look at some samples, okay? And then that power zone also lends the poster to be organized in columns, which I think is a really good choice. Because people are reading across the top and then down the left-hand side, it makes sense for them to then follow in a column pattern the rest of the poster. Contrast. So the principle of contrast, things are easier to read when the contrast is high, and easier to understand and create hierarchy if the contrast is high. So you definitely want to prefer a high contrast when it comes to colors on a poster, because you're going to have a lot of information crammed in a fairly small space. You need that contrast to be high, but you want it to be also professional. Generally speaking, prefer a white background with black or very dark text. That's much easier to read, especially if the font has to be small. That's also helpful with your visuals. If you have a white background for the body of the report or of the poster, then it's easier to see those images and easier to deal with different image file types, so you don't end up with weird boxes, white boxes around things. The exception to that might be having your title, which will be the largest text, having that on a reverse with like the dark blue background and white text is probably okay. But the rest of the poster should really be a white background with your dark text. Make sure you consider font size. Again, you do not want to cram this. You want your font to be as big as possible, and you want to keep it consistent. And you want to just generally be professional with your color choices and your design choices and the choices of contrast. So don't bring in too many colors in terms of the text and the headings and that kind of thing. And even in your graphs and charts, keep them tasteful and professional. Okay, repetition. So you want to repeat the pattern from your report, basically. So your report is organized in a way that is going to be the way that people are going to expect to receive information in the scientific world, and your poster should be as well. So generally speaking, you're going to go in the order that you created in your report. Now, there might be a few exceptions to that, but if you repeat the main headers and the main sections in the same order, that's going to make sense to your audience because your report is already following the guidelines that are expected in your discipline. And then keep your colors, fonts, and sizes consistent. So you want to use repetition. So don't change your body text sizes for no reason. A lot of places just to try to get the text as big as possible. Keep it consistent. Keep your colors consistent. Keep your heading sizes consistent. All of those things give the reader a map to understanding what's what and how they're supposed to read your poster. Alignment. Alignment's really important on posters. You don't want just boxes of information floating around on this big field, okay? Things need to be really organized so that I can walk up to the poster and know exactly where I'm supposed to start, where I'm supposed to end, and how I'm supposed to approach all the information in the middle. So the columns is a really great way to go. It's a little bit easier to read than reading all the way across the page and then all the way across the page again like you would a book. Columns are going to be easier to digest the smaller chunks of information. And you want to prefer a left alignment within those columns, and you definitely don't want to be justifying any of your body text. Full justification is going to cause weird spacing. It's going to make the whole thing a lot more difficult to read. So finally, proximity. Make sure, again, hierarchy matters in everything when it comes to designing a poster or really any piece of technical communication. And you really want to use your headings as a way to create hierarchy. So you're going to keep the information that is connected to a particular heading close to that heading within the column. Sometimes you're going to put things in boxes, but really just grouping with white space is a good choice. And leaving a little bit of a margin around the connected information is a really good way, easy way for people to read it. Boxes are okay, but they can start to feel confined if you've got too tight of margins and that kind of thing. Definitely leave a reasonable margin around the edge of your poster to account for printing and just to generally make it inviting for people to read. If you go right up to the edge with your margin, it's going to start to feel overwhelming and people are just not going to want to read it. So these are just some things to think about. There's a lot to think about when you're creating a poster, but these give you some good, quick tips to consider. So now we're going to look at a couple examples of former students' posters. And all of these are perfectly good examples, but I just want to point out a few things to think about. So on this poster, a few things that are looking good. It's generally easy to read. Again, you're going to see this in a much larger format than you will on the screen, but one thing that's a little confusing is the way that the sources right here go across these two columns. It gives the sources a little bit more higher, like a little bit more priority than the analysis and the conclusions, which is a little bit problematic. I would recommend, rather than doing this, I would recommend perhaps bringing this bar all the way across and making this whole bottom a footer that will feel lower in hierarchy to the rest of the body information if it goes all the way across the bottom of the poster instead of just two columns. So, and I'm sure they were worried about space. Keeping the sources just over here in the third column is another option. And perhaps moving the analysis down and bringing the conclusions up here, and then acknowledgments and then sources. So that's a little bit confusing, not an awesome design choice there, because it makes the poster a little bit hard to follow and messes up the hierarchy a little bit. They're also changing their body text font size, which is a little bit confusing. So over here in the intro and background, it appears to be one size, appears to be a different size in the analysis, an even smaller size in parts of the methods, at least, that still appear to be body text. So pick some font sizes that are reasonable and then stick with them. So keep all of your labels the same size, which can be smaller. Keep your body text the same size throughout in every section. And that's going to make it much easier for the reader to understand what goes with what kind of text they're encountering when they're trying to read it in a hurry. And generally, it's just a lot cleaner and more professional. So those were a couple of thoughts from this poster. So let's look at another one. Okay, so this poster is got some nice white space, I believe. I think that it feels pretty easy to read. There's still a lot of text. I'm not sure how many words are on this poster, but there are quite a few, and so keep the text, as brief as you can. But the text is pretty well organized. There's good white space. It's pretty easy to follow what's going on here. A couple things that I think they can improve on would be that they've got these bullet lists, but you don't want to just have bullet lists for the sake of bullet lists. You want to introduce what is coming in the list. So rather than just contamination with a bunch of bullet points, I would like to see contamination, a sentence explanation, and then quick bullet points that all are in parallel construction and explain or give examples to whatever you're trying to explain in each of these sections. So don't use bullets just to use bullets. They're not helpful. If you don't actually have a list of like information, then you don't need to put it in bullets. Okay. Paragraphs work just fine. And if you're going to have a bulleted list, you certainly need to introduce it with a sentence so that the reader understands immediately what is in the bulleted list. Okay. So that helps a lot. I also like that they have this problem statement up here first, and the purpose of the project. This is a way of getting some of the most important information right up front in the key area in the power zone, so that I can immediately decide if I'm interested in this poster and the subject of this poster. Okay. And then you'll notice that this does have the footer that stretches all the way across. And I think this is a little bit better choice in terms of putting the acknowledgments and the references as sort of the last thing as a footer, like I was talking about in the last one. I think that they've done that better here. Okay. And then we've got another example here. This poster, again, has some good things going on, but a few things that could use some help as well. One thing that's strange is that they've put the title into this blue box at the top. I would rather see this blue box extend under the logo and all the way across than just be floating out here on a white field, which doesn't look real professional. And I'm wondering if this happened to be because they did not have access to a Boise State logo that was on a transparent background, and so it was white. If that happens, it would be better just to make the text the blue on a white field than to have this white field with this blue box, which is a little strange. So I would avoid that kind of thing. This one's a little boxier. If you notice, they're instead of using white space to separate the columns, they're sort of boxing these sections in. That is, I don't know. It works okay, but it's not great. I would rather see a little less information and a little more space, just white space separating it, like we saw in the last poster. I am seeing the figures being labeled really clearly and with a differentiation in the text that makes them easy to follow. There are a lot of visuals here, So be careful about getting too many visuals and making it hard to follow what they mean and where I'm looking. Here in this middle section, there's visuals, and they're not really following any kind of order. They're not using alignment very well with the visuals in this section, which makes it a little bit of a challenge to follow the flow of the information and to understand what I'm looking at, because there's not as much text, which this is great on the amount of text, body text, but of course you want to make sure that everything does make sense. The other thing that I see with this is this summary at the end. So one way that you could try to get the results or the most important information, if you will, up into the power zone would be to put your summary statement first. I know that in your reports, usually the summary statement is at the end, which is great, but this might be a reason to move that summary up top as the first thing people are read, so that you have an opportunity to put your conclusions into or up in the most important space so that people can see those conclusions very first off and see the significance of your work, and then continue to scan through the rest of the poster to understand how you arrived at those conclusions and to get your evidence for the results that you have achieved. So that would be, if you're going to include a summary or consider including a summary, putting it up before your introduction or as part of your introduction might be a good way to really get that key information into the most prime spot on the poster. Okay, so those are a few examples. Remember that a scientific poster is this opportunity to share your research. It's an opportunity to celebrate all of the hard work and time that you have spent working on these senior projects, and you want it to look good to represent you and all of the work that you have done. And here's a few ways to do that, a few things to think about as you put your poster together.